They say a pastor is a man of God, a shepherd, a guide, the one who leads lost souls to salvation. But what if the man standing at the pulpit, the one preaching about truth, love, and righteousness, is the very man hiding the darkest secret of them all? Fairview, Georgia, was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. And in that town, Pastor Jonathan Grayson was a name spoken with admiration. He was respected, trusted, even idolized. A man who delivered powerful sermons that could bring people to tears. A man who made sinners believe they could be saved. But what if the man promising salvation was the one who needed saving the most? Behind the stained glass windows of his church, beyond the warm smiles and firm handshakes, Pastor Grayson was living a lie. A lie so dangerous, so unthinkable that when it was finally uncovered, it would send shockwaves through the entire town. A devoted wife. A forbidden love. A truth so devastating that it could only end in blood. Tonight, we take you inside the life of a pastor who risked everything to protect his secret. A secret that, once exposed, left a woman dead and a community forever changed. Before we jump into this incredible story, take a moment to comment below where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories that will leave a lasting impression. Your support helps us share these powerful messages with the world. Now let's begin. Pastor Jonathan Grayson, 38 years old. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice that could shake the walls of a church. When he spoke, people listened. When he preached, people felt moved, like God himself was speaking through him. His congregation hung on to his every word, believing he was a man of pure faith, a true servant of the Lord. But who was Jonathan Grayson when the church doors closed? To the world he was respected, admired, trusted. The kind of pastor people turned to when they needed guidance. The man who blessed marriages, prayed over the sick, and led funerals with words so powerful, they could bring even the toughest men to tears. But beneath the polished image was a man with a past he didn't want anyone to know. A past that, no matter how much he tried to outrun it, never let go. Jonathan grew up in a home ruled by fear. His father, Reverend Samuel Grayson, was not just a preacher. He was a man who believed in fire, brimstone, and punishment. Sin was not just a mistake in his eyes. It was a sickness that had to be beaten out, prayed away, buried deep. And being a man meant showing no weakness, no hesitation, no fear. But Jonathan had secrets. Secrets he learned to hide from an early age. There was only one person who truly knew him, Nathaniel Carter, or Nate as he called him. Nate wasn't just a friend. He was an escape. While other boys played sports and roughhoused in the dirt, Jonathan and Nate found comfort in each other. Late-night talks under the old oak tree behind the church. Stolen moments when no one was watching. It was innocent at first, just two boys who understood each other in a world that wouldn't understand them. But as they grew older, Jonathan knew what they had was dangerous. His father had preached against people like them, called them an abomination, the worst kind of sinners. And Jonathan was supposed to be better than that. He was supposed to follow the path of righteousness. So when his father pushed him toward ministry, Jonathan accepted. Maybe if he became a pastor, God would take the feelings away. Maybe if he buried himself in prayer, in scripture, in devotion, he could be normal. He could be the man his father expected him to be. The man his town believed he was. But no amount of prayer could erase Nate from his mind. Still, Jonathan did what was expected of him. He rose through the church, his sermons growing more powerful, his reputation stronger. People adored him, but whispers started to spread. A man like him, handsome, successful, godly, why wasn't he married? A pastor without a wife raised questions. Doubts. And Jonathan could not afford doubt. So he did what many before him had done. He found the perfect woman, Evelyn. A kind, gentle, devoted woman. A woman who truly believed she was marrying a man of God. A woman who would stand by his side, smile at his congregation, and make him appear exactly as he needed to be. She loved him. And he needed her. Not as a partner, not as a soulmate, but as a shield. To the church, to the world, they were the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, Jonathan knew the truth. Nathaniel Carter, Nate as everyone called him, was the kind of man who carried the past with him wherever he went. 39 years old, rugged, quiet, with a presence that didn't demand attention but always held it. Some men had a way of making the world feel smaller when they stepped into a room. Nate was one of them. He and Jonathan had grown up side by side, two boys in a town where reputation was everything. But while Jonathan had been raised to believe that faith could fix anything, Nate had never believed in the church. Not once. He had only ever believed in Jonathan. Where Jonathan hid, Nate stood firm. Where Jonathan prayed, Nate accepted. He had never tried to be anything other than what he was, no matter what people whispered behind his back. He had never let fear rule him. And yet, for all his confidence, for all his certainty, there had always been one weakness in his life: Jonathan Grayson. Their bond had been unshakable as kids, but adulthood had changed things. Jonathan had chosen the church. Chosen a life that made their kind of friendship impossible. And Nate? He had let him go. Not because he wanted to, but because Jonathan had made his choice. Or so he thought. Then there was Evelyn Grayson. Evelyn was the kind of woman people admired, not because she was loud or demanded attention, but because she was soft, gentle. A woman who carried kindness in her eyes and warmth in her voice. She had been raised to believe in love, in family, in the goodness of a man devoted to God. And she had believed in Jonathan with all her heart. To her, he was everything a husband should be. Strong, wise, faithful. A leader not just in their home but in their community. Their marriage, she was sure, had been blessed by God himself. She prayed for Jonathan every night, believing that whatever burden he carried, whatever weight pressed on his shoulders, she could help him bear it. But love made people blind. At first, the signs had been too small to notice. The way he avoided her touch. The way his eyes seemed to drift somewhere else, even when he was standing right in front of her. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes. She told herself it was stress. The weight of the church. The pressure of leadership. But deep down, something inside her whispered. Something was wrong. Jonathan Grayson had spent his whole life fighting a war no one could see. By day, he stood at the pulpit, his deep, commanding voice filling the church, preaching about righteousness, about resisting sin, about the path to salvation. People hung on to his every word, believing he was a man of unshakable faith. A man who had conquered temptation. A man who walked so closely with God that even the devil himself had no hold on him. But at night? At night, when the church lights dimmed and the congregation had gone home, the war inside him raged. No matter how much he prayed, no matter how much he fasted, no matter how many hours he spent reading scripture, he couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted him. He couldn't escape him. Nate. He told himself that he was just being a good friend. That Nate needed guidance. That he, as a pastor, had a responsibility to be there for him. But if that was true, why did he feel this way? Why did his heart race every time Nate showed up unannounced? Why did he find himself waiting, hoping, aching for those late-night visits? The missionary house became their meeting place. Nate would knock on the door, always casual, always relaxed, like it was nothing. Like he wasn't the only thing Jonathan thought about when he closed his eyes at night. They talked for hours. About life, about the past, about things Jonathan couldn't talk about with anyone else. He told himself it was innocent. He was just helping a friend. And yet, when the conversations ended and Nate left, Jonathan would sit alone in the dimly lit room, staring at the spot where he had just been, feeling something heavy in his chest. Something he couldn't name. Something he couldn't pray away. At home, Evelyn started to notice things. She had always been patient with Jonathan, always understanding. But something was different now. The way he avoided her touch. The way he barely met her eyes. The way he always had an excuse. Always said he needed to stay spiritually focused. At first she believed him. Of course he was focused on God. That was the kind of man he was. That was what made him such a good pastor, such a good husband. But then the doubts crept in. Because a man devoted to God didn't come home smelling like a place he shouldn't have been. A man devoted to God didn't flinch when his wife reached for his hand. And a man devoted to God didn't lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts he refused to share. Jonathan told himself it would never happen. 4 weeks he had walked a tightrope, balancing his faith, his reputation, his marriage, all while keeping Nate at arm's length. He had convinced himself that the late-night talks, the lingering glances, the way his chest ached when Nate was near but not close enough, it all meant nothing. But one night the dam broke. It started the way it always did. Nate showed up at the missionary house, knocking on the door like he always did, like this was just another conversation between old friends. Jonathan let him in, heart pounding, stomach twisting. They talked, but the words didn't matter. It was in the way their hands brushed. The way Jonathan didn't pull away. The way the silence between them stretched too long, too charged, too heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. And then, it happened. A line was crossed. A vow was shattered. Everything Jonathan had spent his life building. His faith, his marriage, his name, it all burned away in an instant. Afterward, he sat in the dim light, hands shaking, head bowed. He prayed, begged for forgiveness, swore it would never happen again. But deep down he knew he was lying. Because the second Nate reached for him again, Jonathan didn't resist. They told themselves it was temporary. Just a weakness. Just a moment of failing. But moments turned into nights. Nights turned into something they couldn't stop. Jonathan became reckless. He found excuses to be away from home. He canceled plans with Evelyn, promising he was busy with church matters. When she reached for him at night, he turned away. When she asked if everything was okay, he told her she was imagining things. But Evelyn wasn't imagining things. She wasn't blind to the way her husband barely acknowledged her. The way his mind seemed far away, lost in something he refused to share. And she wasn't deaf to the whispers. People in town had started to talk. The pastor and his old friend, always together, always sneaking off for private meetings. At first she brushed it off. Jonathan was a man of God. A faithful husband. A devoted leader. But then, one night everything changed. Evelyn never questioned Jonathan's late nights at the missionary house. She told herself he was a man of God, that his work never ended. She believed he was praying, studying scripture, preparing his next sermon. And when he came home exhausted, distant, barely looking at her, she swallowed her hurt and reminded herself, being a pastor's wife meant sacrifice. But something didn't sit right. That night she decided to surprise him. She spent an hour in the kitchen, carefully preparing his favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread. She wrapped it up neatly, humming to herself, convinced that all he needed was a warm meal, a reminder of home, of love. It was late when she arrived at the missionary house. The lights were dim, the air thick with the scent of old books and candle wax. She pushed the door open, expecting to find Jonathan alone, hunched over his Bible, deep in thought. Instead, she found something else. She stopped in the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat. There, tangled together in the dim light, was her husband, her pastor, Jonathan Grayson. And he was not alone. Nate's hands were on him, pulling him close. Jonathan's face, his body, his everything, was pressed against another man in a way no wife should ever have to witness. The tray in Evelyn's hands trembled. The scent of warm food mixed with the choking smell of betrayal. Jonathan and Nate froze. For a moment, the world held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Evelyn did not scream. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She simply stood there, staring, eyes wide, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. And then, without a single word, she turned and walked away. That silence, oh, that silence, was worse than if she had screamed. It was worse than if she had shattered every window in that tiny room with her cries. It was worse than if she had cursed him, thrown things, begged him to explain. Jonathan wanted to call out, to stop her, to say something, anything, but his throat closed up. His legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Nate's face was pale, his hands shaking. They both knew. That silence meant something far worse than rage. That silence meant the truth had been seen. And once the truth was seen, there was no undoing it. Jonathan couldn't breathe. His whole world was spinning out of control. Evelyn had seen everything. She knew. She knew the truth he had spent his entire life burying. The truth he prayed would never come to light. The truth that could destroy everything. He rushed after her, his feet stumbling over themselves as she walked away from the missionary house. "Evelyn, wait," he pleaded, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking. Jonathan's chest tightened. His heart pounded against his ribs. He knew his wife. She wasn't the type to cause a scene, not in public, not in front of the church. But what would she do behind closed doors? Would she tell someone? Would she tell everyone? Would she go to the elders? The congregation? Would she stand up on Sunday morning and expose him right there in the Lord's house? Would she take away everything? His reputation. His church. His entire life. Nate's hand clamped down on his shoulder. "We have to stop her," he muttered, his voice shaking. "If she talks, we're done." Jonathan swallowed hard. His mind was racing. He had to reason with her. That's all. She loved him. She was his wife. He could make her understand. He hurried after her, stepping in front of her just before she reached the door. "Evelyn," he said again, his hands shaking. "Just, please. Let's talk." She looked at him then. Looked right into his eyes. And that was when he knew. She wasn't going to stay silent. There was nothing to say. Nothing to fix. She was going to tell. Jonathan's breath came fast and shallow. Panic clawed up his throat like a wild animal trying to escape. He couldn't let that happen. He reached for her, but she pulled away. "No," she said, her voice small but steady. "Don't touch me." He grabbed her arm. "Evelyn, please." She yanked away harder this time, her back hitting the wall. "Let me go, Jonathan." Jonathan's grip tightened. "I can't." She struggled, twisting, her nails digging into his wrist. And then she screamed. Jonathan's whole body went cold. That scream, it wasn't just fear. It wasn't just anger. It was something else. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized that the man she trusted most in the world was capable of anything. Even this. Before he could think, before he could stop himself, his hand clamped over her mouth. "Shoo," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, just, please." She fought harder. Her legs kicked, her hands flailed, her body writhed beneath him. Nate was there in an instant. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her down. "Jonathan," he panted, "we have to." Jonathan didn't hear the rest. Evelyn was still fighting. She wasn't giving up. Jonathan pressed harder. She jerked, gasped. Her fingers clawed at his hand. Her body twisted under their grip. Then, stillness. Jonathan didn't move. Nate didn't move. Evelyn didn't move. For the first time that night there was silence. A horrible, suffocating silence. Jonathan let go. Evelyn's body slumped to the floor. Her eyes, once so full of warmth, of love, of devotion, stared blankly ahead. Gone. Jonathan staggered back, his hands trembling, his heart hammering. No. No, no, no. What had he done? What had they done? He looked at Nate, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Nate looked back at him, his face pale, his lips parted in shock. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Jonathan stood frozen, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The weight of what had just happened was crushing him. His hands trembled as he looked down at Evelyn's lifeless body. She was gone. The woman who had prayed for him. The woman who had promised to stand by him. The woman who had trusted him with her heart. And now she was nothing but a problem that needed to be solved. Nate's voice was barely above a whisper. "Jonathan, what do we do?" Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. His mind was spinning, screaming at him to wake up from this nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. He had to think. No one could ever know. No one. He crouched beside Evelyn's still body, brushing a shaking hand over his face. "We have to get rid of her." Nate took a step back. "Jonathan, this is crazy. We need to call someone. We need." Jonathan snapped his head up, his eyes wild. "Call who, Nate? The police? Tell them what?" That the beloved Pastor Jonathan Grayson just killed his wife with his own 2 hands. He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Do you know what they'll do to me? To us." Nate clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair. He didn't argue. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. If Evelyn's body was found, if anyone found out what really happened, their lives were over. Jonathan took a deep, shuddering breath and forced himself to move. His hand slid under Evelyn's limp body. He lifted her, her head rolling against his chest. She was still warm. He couldn't think about that. He carried her to his car, his legs weak beneath him, every step heavier than the last. He laid her carefully in the back seat, covering her with an old church blanket. His hands hovered over her face for a second, his fingers twitching, then he yanked the blanket up and slammed the door shut. Nate slid into the passenger seat without a word. Jonathan drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the thunderous pounding of his own heart. The river was only a few miles away. A deep, fast-moving current. A place where things disappeared. By the time they reached the riverbank, the sky was a deep, endless black. The world was quiet except for the sound of rushing water. Jonathan and Nate worked quickly, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of Evelyn's body was nothing compared to the weight of what they had done. They waded into the freezing water, their feet slipping on the slick rocks beneath them. Then, without speaking, they let go. The current took her immediately, pulling her into the darkness. Jonathan didn't watch. He couldn't. He turned away, stumbling back to the car, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. It was done. But the nightmare was far from over. The next morning, Jonathan stood in front of his congregation, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He gripped the pulpit, his fingers digging into the wood. His voice cracked as he spoke. "My wife, my beautiful Evelyn, is missing." A murmur spread through the church. Gasps, whispers, concerned faces staring up at him. He lowered his head, shaking it slowly. "She never came home last night. I don't know where she is. Please, please pray for her safe return." His voice broke on the last word. And just like that, the room was filled with sobs. Mothers clutched their children. Husbands wrapped their arms around their wives. Friends leaned on one another, their faces streaked with tears. The beloved Pastor Jonathan Grayson was a broken man, a grieving husband, a desperate soul crying out for help. And they believed every single word. They held candlelight vigils. They plastered her face on flyers. They searched the woods, the roads, the town, calling her name, hoping, praying. Jonathan led them all. He knelt at the altar, weeping into his hands. He stood in front of news cameras, his voice shaking as he begged for her safe return. "I just want my wife back," he choked out, his eyes rimmed red, his shoulders trembling. "If anyone knows anything, please help me bring her home." The town rallied behind him. They called him strong. They called him faithful. They said if anyone could endure this trial with grace, it was Pastor Grayson. No one suspected a thing. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And neither does the truth. 3 days passed. 3 long days of prayer circles, candlelight vigils, and desperate pleas from Jonathan Grayson. His face was all over the news, his voice thick with sorrow as he begged for answers. The town believed him. They wept for him. They held on to his every word. But then, everything changed. A fisherman was out on the river that morning, just as the sun was breaking through the mist. He had cast his line, expecting nothing more than another quiet day on the water. But as he reeled in his line, something caught his eye. Something pale, tangled in the reeds near the riverbank. His breath hitched. His hands shook. And when he got closer, he saw her. Evelyn Grayson. Her body was bloated from the water, her dress clinging to her skin. But even through the swelling and bruising, it was clear, this was no accident. The police arrived within the hour. The riverbank became a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the area as officers swarmed the site, murmuring to each other, their faces grim. The autopsy was swift. The cause of death was clear. Strangulation. This wasn't a case of a woman wandering off and drowning. This was murder. And now the hunt was on. Investigators combed through security footage, retracing Evelyn's last steps. It didn't take long for them to find it. The camera at the Missionary house showed Evelyn arriving that night, carrying a small container, probably the home-cooked meal she had made for her husband. But there was one problem. She was never seen leaving. And Jonathan Grayson had no explanation. The questions came fast. The pressure mounted. Jonathan held his ground at first, keeping his voice steady, his expression unreadable. But there was one person who wasn't as strong. One person who cracked under the weight of it all. Nate. Hours of questioning wore him down. The guilt ate at him. The fear consumed him. And when the detective leaned in, voice low, eyes sharp, and said, "Tell the truth, Nate. It's over." Nate did. He told them everything. How Jonathan had panicked. How Evelyn had fought. How the two of them had done the unthinkable. How they had carried her to the car, driven to the river, and watched the current take her away. He signed his confession. And just like that, Jonathan's world collapsed. It was Sunday morning. The church was packed, filled with devoted followers, hanging on their pastor's every word. Jonathan stood at the altar, his voice ringing through the sanctuary, delivering a sermon about faith, about redemption. Then the doors burst open. Gasps filled the room as officers flooded in, their badges glinting under the church lights. The congregation turned in shock, murmuring, whispering. And then, the words that shattered everything. "Jonathan Grayson, you are under arrest for the murder of Evelyn Grayson." Silence. Jonathan's face drained of color. His Bible slipped from his hands, landing with a dull thud on the pulpit. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The congregation watched, eyes wide, hands over their mouths, as their beloved pastor, God's chosen man, was led away in chains. The whispers grew. The betrayal settled in. Because now the truth was out. And there was no praying his way out of this one. The courtroom was packed. People squeezed into the wooden benches, their faces tight with anger, sadness, disbelief. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras flashing, microphones ready. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Jonathan Grayson sat at the defense table, his face like stone. No tears. No emotion. Just empty eyes staring straight ahead as if none of this was real. But it was real. The prosecutor spoke with fire in his voice. He painted the picture for the jury, how Jonathan, a man trusted by so many, had betrayed his own wife in the worst way. How he had taken her life to protect his secret. How he had lied to his congregation, faked his grief, and stood in God's house pretending to be a righteous man while knowing exactly what he had done. Then came Nate. The room fell silent as he walked to the witness stand. His hands shook as he took the oath. His voice cracked as he spoke, and when he finally looked at Jonathan, his eyes filled with something between regret and disgust. He told them everything. How it started. How they had justified it. How it all led to that awful night. Jonathan never looked at him. Not once. Evelyn's parents took the stand next. Her mother clutched a tissue, her hands trembling, her face pale. She tried to speak, but her words broke apart, lost in sobs. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes red, his voice hoarse with pain. She loved him. She trusted him. And he killed her. The jury didn't need long. They left to deliberate, and before anyone could even stretch their legs, they were back. The verdict was read. Guilty. Life in prison. No chance of parole. Jonathan didn't flinch. The gavel slammed. The case was closed. But the damage was forever. The aftermath was like a storm. Evelyn's parents, broken but determined, refused to let her name fade into tragedy. They started a foundation in her honor, one that helped women in dangerous situations, one that made sure no one else would suffer as she had. The church, once thriving, once full, became a ghost of what it had been. People left in droves. Some couldn't believe their pastor had done such a thing. Others felt like fools for ever believing in him. The once powerful congregation crumbled, its walls still standing, but its spirit long gone. Jonathan's family disappeared. His siblings packed up and moved away, unable to bear the shame. His parents, once so proud of their son, could no longer speak his name without their voices shaking. And the community? They were left with questions. How had they not seen it? How had they let a man like him lead them? They had trusted him with their faith, and he had betrayed them all. Some stories fade. Some get lost in time. But this one left a scar. Power can be dangerous. Secrets can destroy lives. Even the most trusted leaders can hide the darkest truths. Evelyn trusted her husband with her life. She never imagined he would take it from her. Be careful who you put your faith in, because sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the worst. Stay vigilant. More stories to come.